This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, DJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 331 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The most common type of questions that I got for this week's Mailbag show were about how your approach changes when you're making start-sit choices in the fantasy football playoffs. I understand the reason for the questions, but guys, let's not make this complicated. You're still playing the exact same game that you played in Week 12 and Week 13. Your goal is the exact same. The only difference is that if you lose, you're not playing anymore. That's it. So the way I go about making start-sit decisions isn't really any different than it normally is. The idea that you have to play the guys who got you there doesn't really make any sense. Like, Tevin Coleman helped get you there. Tevin Coleman was great for a big stretch of the season. Are you confidently playing him this week with the season on the line? Of course not. Don't overthink things. Do what you'd normally do. Because what got you to this point isn't just an individual player. It's a process. It's your process. You've made good decisions so far, so don't go changing your decision-making process just because there's more on the line. Now, before getting into this week's questions, we've got another free roll for you FanDuel Podcast Network listeners. Just head to fanduel.com/league/Jim. That's the name Jim. Make a lineup and enter for a chance to win a NumberFire premium subscription and a little bit of cash. That's fanduel.com/league/Jim. The first question this week is a good example of what I was talking about in the intro. So I thought that it would be helpful to give you guys some context. It's from @Robberjan. Hi JJ, big fan from Brazil here. Regarding recent Raheem Mostert overshadowing Tevin Coleman, I would like to know how to deal with decisions of benching former home runners when it's playoff time. Those guys showed high ceilings, so it bugs me to remove them from my squad. P.S. Love the pod. So thanks for the love, and I always love hearing from listeners outside the United States. It's really cool to me. But to your question, this sort of relates back to the players who got me here thing that I just talked about. I actually used Tevin Coleman as my example before knowing that I was going to talk about this question on the show, so it worked out pretty well. But you've got to look at everything objectively. I mean, think of it this way. If a player tore his ACL in Week 14, you obviously wouldn't use him in Week 15, even if that player got you there. Tevin Coleman's performed really poorly over the last couple of weeks because the 49ers started featuring Raheem Mostert. You have to adjust the way that you view Coleman and that backfield as a result. Mostert's logically the most reliable, and then Breida, and then Tevin Coleman. That makes Coleman someone that you can't trust and someone that you've got to keep on your bench, even though he helped you throughout the season. This next question is from @Zipcode. Do your opponent's top players influence your choice of defense at all? The only place it might influence my defensive choice is at quarterback, only because they control so much of the game, and they're the ones who turn the ball over the most. And that's what matters at defense most. But if you think about it, the instances where this would actually happen, they're pretty slim. Quarterbacks who are usable in fantasy football generally don't have an opposing defense that's also usable, because those quarterbacks are good. There are instances like Jameis Winston, but I'm just saying that most of the time, you won't run into this problem. But then on top of that, that defense has to be available. And then you also have to weigh whether or not you need that type of upside. The only way I'd purposely play a defense that's facing my opponent's quarterback is if I'm a huge underdog. Because for every interception or fumble, it's a 4-point gain rather than a 2-point one. So I'd say overall, no. I don't really think about it that much. This next question is from @DocavocDFS. In my season-long league next year, I'm considering awarding the top 4 spots based on record, the 5th to most points, and the final spot to whichever remaining team has the most regular season wins against the first 5 teams in the playoffs. Ridiculous? I do think it's a little bit ridiculous and unnecessary, yeah. Not the spot for most points, but the final spot. You have to assume that there would be ties, meaning the 6th team that's not in had an equal number of wins against the other 5 teams. That would happen to multiple teams. And then if you're in a 12-team league, you're not facing every team in your league once, so the schedule would screw things up too. My advice would be to give spots to the top 4 teams and then have the next 2 spots for the most points that aren't currently in, or just make that the 6th spot. This next question says, suggestions on how to make a change in playoff structure to account for teams that have been great all year and then lose due to some weird occurrences in the first round. What's the best way to account for the random results that can occur and ruin a good team in a given week? Look, this is sort of what fantasy football is. There's a luck element to it, and that's partially what makes it fun. Now, don't take this the wrong way. Fantasy football is far from all luck, and I want the objectively best teams to win the championship. But the only way around something like this is to give that better team entering the playoffs some sort of advantage, like a 5-point advantage or something, or have a multi-week playoff. Maybe the fairest way to decide the playoffs for your league would be an all-play format, where in round 1, the 2 best scorers move on. There's no matchup. In round 2, the 2 best scorers move on. And then there's one championship. But look, I've been on the wrong side of that variance plenty of times, especially in my home league. I'm legitimately cursed in my home league. But that's sort of the fun for a league with a bunch of old friends who love to use fantasy football as a vehicle to stay in touch. It's the one-on-one win and move on format. There are ways to make it fairer and to reward teams that were better over a longer period of time. And I just gave some examples of how to do that. But I do think it's still important in some leagues, probably most leagues, since most leagues aren't ultra competitive for tons of money. But it's important to not lose sort of that charm of fantasy football. This next question is from @tree_nerd. This year, you've been using points above average a lot when describing, for instance, a defense that allows a quarterback to score 5.5 points more than their average. Don't recall this being a metric that you used in past seasons. What do you like about it? Why the shift towards using it so much? One of the things that I push myself to do every year is find ways to make fantasy football data more interesting and consumable. I don't think I'm the best data person in the fantasy football space at all. I know for a fact that I'm not. But what I do know is that I can still work with data. Things that have to do with numbers, I'm generally good with. But to me, my goal with what I do is to sort of be a bridge for you guys, to connect you to a more complex way of looking at fantasy football. My job is very much about being a good communicator, and then taking ideas that the average person may not be able to easily comprehend, and taking those ideas and making them consumable. Now, I've been tracking fantasy points versus expectation for a few years now. But it didn't really click for me until this year to make that a bigger part of this podcast and how I present this data. Because honestly, with each year, the audience gets smarter and smarter in the fantasy football space. Like 10 years ago, not only was the data just not available, but people didn't have the same passion for this game as they do now. With that passion and more readily available data, everyone's become smarter and better. So basically what I'm saying is with every season, I can sort of introduce new ways of looking at the game. That was just one of those things this year. At some point, I did the same thing with yards versus touchdowns when speaking about touchdown regression. Back in the day, like years ago, I used to always talk about usable performances, top 12 and 24 performances. So to answer your question more directly, I'm using it more because I'm trying to communicate the right information at the right time. You guys all get better each year. And my goal is to also get better each year with what I produce and how I communicate that information. This next question is from @RossVerba. When will you begin to dive into the 2020 class? Yeah, so I usually start digging in during the middle of January. I'll be doing the Late Round podcast 4 times a week for just one more week. So next week's the last week for 4 times per week. And then I'll get on the schedule of twice a week, with one of those being a mailbag episode. But this is also me saying that when the season's over, I'm not done. And you guys should stick around. Because really, I think the most intriguing podcasts come out during the off season. During the offseason, I get some time to think and breathe. In season, it's a lot more process-oriented and the same type of content over and over again. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's fun to produce. It's just that I like to take a step back and look at bigger trends and figure out interesting strategies. So don't leave me when the season's over. And if you're into the NFL draft and rookie drafts for dynasty leagues, I'll be getting into prospect work in about a month. This next question is from @CryptoCrutches. I get all the hype about Evans' replacement options in Tampa Bay, but Ridley out and nobody really hyping Gage. Because Hooper is back, maybe? I would say it's partially Hooper. It's partially that Gage has shown to be more of a high floor play and not a high ceiling play given his slot role in that offense. And then probably most importantly, it's the matchup. Tampa Bay gets Detroit this week. Atlanta gets San Francisco. But I honestly would probably just avoid the secondary receivers on both of these teams this week if I could. There's just a lot of ambiguity there. This next question is from @Nolan_Hughes24. Why are handcuff running backs so heavily hyped and promoted pre-draft, not necessarily by you, when they're often immediately dropped? Darwin Thompson, Justice Hill, Darrell Henderson come to mind. So I did a study on handcuffing running backs a couple of years ago, and I found that number one, we don't always get the handcuff right. We don't always know who the handcuff's going to be. Number two, when a handcuff emerges, he often doesn't even produce. And number three, to your point, Nolan, injuries to running backs generally happen later in the season, at least among the subset that I analyzed. This is why I advocate to not draft handcuffs, but to pick them up later in the season instead. Though I think with your examples, it was a little bit different. The hope for those rookie running backs was that they'd simply emerge. You were making high upside dart throws. But this offseason, I do plan on refreshing that handcuff running backs article and podcast. I think it might be helpful. This last question is from @ChrisEV94267086. Who is your 2020 DJ Chark? That wide receiver no one was talking about this time last year that could explode to be a great dynasty asset we can acquire cheaply in the offseason. Love the pod. Thanks. Yes, I think that you just have to look at players in this year's class who underperformed and haven't had a huge chance yet. And the two that I liked coming out who haven't performed yet are JJ Arcega-Whiteside and Andy Isabella. I'm not that surprised that neither guy had big rookie seasons, but their profiles do tell us that they should be good players in the NFL. And we've seen glimpses of it, especially with Isabella. So those are two players that I'd buy low on this offseason who could make a big impact next year. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And like I've been saying, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and good luck in your playoff matchups.